Hello, everybody. I'm Ed Robinson, and welcome to another exciting edition of At the Rim. This is the program that gets you caught up on anything and everything happening around the NBA. On this edition of the program, I have Nick Agar-Johnson on the program. He's the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. On the program, we preview the 2024 Eastern Conference Finals and Western Conference Finals matchups. Nick will have great insight, and he'll definitely join us on the program real soon. So stay tuned for that. The interview is going to be really good, so check it out. All right, before we get to Nick with the preview of the Eastern Conference and Western Conference Finals matchups, let's give you a current update on our current season award winners. So currently, our this year's league MVP belongs to Nikola Jokic from the Denver Nuggets. The Defensive Player of the Year is Rudy Gobert from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Victor Wembanyama from the San Antonio Spurs is the Rookie of the Year. Sixth Man of the Year belongs to Naz Reid from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Most Improved Player belongs to Tyrese Maxey from the Philadelphia 76ers. The Clutch Player of the Year goes to Steph Curry from the Golden State Warriors. The Coach of the Year award winner is Mark Daigneault from the Oklahoma City Thunder. Executive of the Year belongs to Brad Stevens from the Boston Celtics. The NBA Sportsmanship Award winner is Tyrese Maxey from the Philadelphia 76ers. So Tyrese, not only Most Improved Player, but also the Sportsmanship Award winner. Mike Conley of the Minnesota Timberwolves is the Twyman Stokes Teammate of the Year award winner. Karl Anthony Towns from the Minnesota Timberwolves wins the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Social Justice Champion Award. And Alex Caruso from the Chicago Bulls is the winner of the NBA Hustle Award. Now, recently, we had our All-NBA defensive teams released, as well as the All-NBA the NBA All-Rookie teams. Let's start off with the All-Defensive teams. The All-NBA defensive first team is Bam Adebayo from the Miami Heat, Anthony Davis from the Los Angeles Lakers, Rudy Gobert from the Minnesota Timberwolves, Herb Jones from the New Orleans Pelicans, and Victor Wembanyama from the San Antonio Spurs. The all-defensive second team is Alex Caruso from the Chicago Bulls, Drew Holiday from the Boston Celtics, Jaden McDaniels from the Minnesota Timberwolves, Jalen Suggs from the Orlando Magic, and Derek White from the Boston Celtics. Let's move over now to our all-rookie teams. The NBA all-rookie first team is Chet Holmgren from the Oklahoma City Thunder, Jaime Jaquez Jr. from the Miami Heat, Brandon Miller from the Charlotte Hornets, Brandon Pachimsky from the Golden State Warriors, and Victor Wembanyama from the San Antonio Spurs. And the all-rookie second team is Keontae George from the Utah Jazz, Gigi Jackson from the Memphis Grizzlies, Derek Lively from the Dallas Mavericks, Amen Thompson from the Houston Rockets, and Cason Wallace from the Oklahoma City Thunder. So that currently takes care of your season award winners, and of course, our all-NBA selections. Congratulations to the gentlemen making the all-defensive first and second teams and the all-rookie first and second teams. All right, so now currently the latest going on with the NBA media rights deal. So Disney, NBC, and Amazon, they're formalizing written contracts this week. Now, according to Sports Business Journal, industry sources believe that ESPN will ultimately pay $2.8 billion annually for the league's A package, which includes the NBA Finals, primetime games, the WNBA, and likely shared international rights. NBC's proposed package is believed to be worth between $2.5 and $2.6 billion annually, and would probably include a basketball night in America or a Sunday night basketball following the NFL season, a total of 2 primetime windows a week, a conference semifinals, and a conference final. Amazon's deal is believed to be worth 1.8 and is believed to be worth between 1.8 billion and 2 billion, and would likely include the Emirates in-season tournament, the SoFi play-in tournament, first-round playoff games, the WNBA, and international rights. So in each of the packages, ESPN and Amazon would be proposed to have the WNBA and the international rights, as well as select NBA games, while as NBC in their package would have basketball night in America or Sunday night basketball following the NFL season. Of course, 2 primetime games a week, conference semifinal and a conference final. However, Warner Brothers Discovery, the company that owns TNT, they're still believed to be in these contract talks as well. Everything has been changing and everything has been fluid every day, with Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav seeing if there's an opportunity for him to match it. Matter of fact, again, according to an article from Sports Business Journal, according to sources, the league will take NBC's contract to Warner Brothers Discovery to see if Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav is able to match it in total value. And again, this thing has been moving so fast and so fluid. I mean, this is an ever-changing situation. There's also things up in the air with the future of inside the NBA, which, in my opinion, and a lot of people's other people's opinions, could be the best sports studio show, and if not in the history of sports, maybe close to being the best sports studio show in the history of sports, whether it be not just NBA, but really in all sports as a whole. Now, again, according to the story, which was presented by the Sports Business Journal, Zaslav's company paid $0.2 billion for the NBA media rights deal a decade ago, and it's believed that he would only have to pay between $1.8 billion and $2.1 billion to retain the B package this time around, and if everything falls, unless other things happen. So, bottom line, again, if Warner Brothers Discovery doesn't match the offer that is going to be presented to them by NBC, then TNT could in fact lose the NBA. Next year would be the final year for the NBA on TNT in the 2024-2025 season. So again, nothing is etched in stone as of yet. There's still negotiations going on, and it seems like we're close to deals, but now things are being presented. A lot of stuff is happening where there could be some more things on the table that Warner Brothers Discovery could be in the fold again on certain things. Again, there was reports that David Zaslav was at the Knicks game wearing Knicks gear and so on and so forth. I mean, that doesn't mean anything, but again, you know how it is with these negotiations. You just never know. So again, when we talk about sports studio shows like Inside the NBA being on TNT, that would be devastating if that's lost. And there's still a glimmer of hope. Maybe everything would work out where either TNT would remain having the NBA, or maybe packages can be worked out where one network may get something, or another, one of the streaming services could get that. Who knows what happens? Who knows what would happen? But man, that would be something else when you have a show that has been on for so long, and then you have to look at the other hosts that are on the show, like Ernie Johnson. Ernie Johnson's made it perfectly clear that his loyalty remains to Turner Sports, because he not only does he cover the NBA, but he covers other sports as well. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how this thing unfolds, and certainly Shaquille O'Neal, Kenny Smith, we don't know if TNT loses the NBA. We don't know what's going to happen with them. Charles Barkley has already said it openly that come a free agent if the NBA was to lose TNT. And if you know about the history with Turner Sports, TNT, you know that the NBA began on TBS in 1984, and it just shot off like a rocket, covering NBA games, and then the All-Star Weekend, which really put the network on a whole nother level. And also TBS at one time carried Atlanta Hawks basketball, and then TNT got the coverage in 1989, and that was the same year that Inside the NBA began broadcasting, and Ernie Johnson's been the host of that program since 1990. So it would be devastating, but also too, if NBC gets the rights to the NBA, it would be a return. You know, during the 90s and early 2000s, NBC, great games, great announcers with Bob Costas, Ahmad Rashad, Marv Albert, Mike Fratello, just to name a few. So you would lose one, but it would be the return of something special. But hey, as I stated earlier, deals are still being finalized, so nothing is on the table as of yet. All right, so that takes care of that, and now it's time for When we come back, we'll have an interview with Nick Agar-Johnson. He's a host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, an editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, a co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. We preview the 2024 Eastern Conference Finals and Western Conference Finals matchups. Let's welcome him back to the program. He's the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and he's an editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Let's welcome him back, Mr. Nick Agar-Johnson. Hey, Nick, welcome back, my man.
Ed, thanks much for having me back on the show. It's a great time of year to be a basketball fan. We've got two really exciting conference finals coming up, and I'm looking forward to breaking them down with you.
Oh, man, you're absolutely right about that. And again, as always, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on the program. Let's start with the Eastern Conference Finals matchup. We have the Indiana Pacers going up against the Boston Celtics. So before we get specifically into this series, the Pacers and the Knicks, we know about this rivalry, right? Going back to the 90s, Reggie Miller, Spike Lee, Patrick Ewing, and so on and so forth. And again, we saw Jalen Brunson do what he's done best, especially during this postseason run, but the injuries were just too much for the Knicks to overcome. Briefly, give me your thoughts on the series with the Pacers and the Knicks.
Yeah, it's really too bad that series ended the way that it did, just purely because this was, a very hard-fought, tight series right up until the very end, and the Knicks just fell apart due to injury. There's only so much that guys can do to, try and be out there when they're playing hurt. I mean, OG Anunoby, he ended up playing 5 minutes in that game, but it was clear from the moment he stepped on the court that he was barely able to walk, much less, run and actually play basketball. And, Jalen Brunson with the broken hand in the middle of that game as well, not to mention that, the Knicks these entire playoffs have been without Julius Randle, who's, their number 2 guy the entire year. It was an unfortunate end to the season for the Knicks, and certainly, in the aftermath of the series, Jalen Brunson was very accountable for, how the Knicks wanted to end their season better than they did despite the injuries, but ultimately, I mean, that final game didn't really tell the story of the series to me, which was, a hard-fought, worthy addition to the long-running rivalry between the New York Knicks and the Indiana Pacers. And, it would have been nice if the ending didn't feel as deflating as it did because of the Knicks' injuries. But, I mean, ultimately, this was an awesome series, and it's too bad that it ended the way it did because there was a lot of great basketball play between those two teams, as there often is when these two teams meet in the playoffs.
Yeah, that was a fun series, an interesting series, and as you said, Nick, towards the end, there's only so much that you could do, and the injuries just mounted for the Knicks. But Jalen Brunson, wow, I mean, a superstar indeed, and definitely looking forward to what's to come next for the New York Knicks, not just for Jalen, but also for Josh Hart and Dante DiVincenzo and Julius Randle. Well, hopefully he'll be healthy next season, as well as OG Anunoby and also the other guys like Mitchell Robinson and Isaiah Hartenstein. And the Indiana Pacers, Tyrese Halliburton, listen, he is a walking three-pointer. I mean, that's offense galore on that team. Also, we saw Andrew Nembhard, also Lee Smith. We also saw Miles Turner. T.J. McConnell is the epitome of hustle. Give me your thoughts on the Pacers and how they performed in that series.
Yeah, I mean, for as much as the series between the Knicks and the Pacers sort of ended on a down note with the Knicks injuries, this Pacers team, they've had a little bit of luck, but I think what, people tend to forget is pretty much every NBA champion ever has had some kind of injury luck go their way on the way to the championship. And so, for this 6th seed Indiana Pacers to have even been facing the Knicks in the conference semifinals at all was a bit of an upset. And, for them to go to the conference finals with Tyrese Halliburton, as young as he is, still on the rise. I mean, I've been a huge Tyrese Halliburton fan since before he even entered the NBA as a draft prospect, and he has come good on every single promise he possibly could have made. And, this Pacers team has been an incredibly fun watch all season. As you mentioned, just one of the most dynamic, get up and down the court, put in a ton of buckets kind of teams that we've literally ever seen in NBA history. I mean, they led the league in points per game this year. They had the second greatest offensive rating of all time this year. I mean, this was a spectacular Pacers team, but, with any, team led by a young player like the Pacers and Tyrese Haliburton, there's sort of there's an expectation that, there'll be a bit of time for guys to, learn the ropes, to, get used to playoff basketball, to sort of adjust to the difference between playoff basketball and regular season basketball, to, sort of take those lumps that many teams take before they really can, lock themselves in as top-tier playoff squads. And this Pacers team is well ahead of schedule, and with Tyrese Haliburton running the show, they'll only get better. So for them to be this far along in the playoffs with Tyrese Haliburton in his age 23 season is really, really impressive. And, yes, they got some injury luck along the way, but again, pretty much every team that manages to make it to the NBA Conference Finals has had some kind of injury luck along the way. And for the Pacers, they beat everybody who was in front of them. And even if the Knicks series ended on sort of a sour note with those injuries, the Pacers team was able to, handle it and advance in the playoffs. Again, at Tyrese Haliburton's age, this Pacers team is only going to be on the way up going forward. And so for them to have this kind of success so early on is really impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right about that. And, I mean, big things are in store for the Indiana Pacers, and especially with their superstar, Tyrese Haliburton, and the other gentleman, like a Pascal Siakam. I mean, the one that brings that veteran leadership and the championship experience. And, of course, Aaron Nesmith, Miles Turner, Andrew Nembhard, and T.J. McConnell, just to name a few. So let's get to the other series that had wrapped up in the Eastern Conference, the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavaliers. I mean, it was to be expected, right? Boston came in and they handled their business. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown and company, no Kristaps Porzingis, no problem. Al Horford, the ageless wonder. Cleveland hampered by injuries, no Jared Allen. Donovan Mitchell was banged up, but Boston did what they were supposed to do. Give me your thoughts on the Celtics-Cavaliers series.
Yeah, I think you summarized it the best way possible. Boston did what they were supposed to do. I mean, this was a team that was dominant all season, and so, for them to come out on top over the Cavaliers, especially with Jared Allen out, was not particularly surprising. I mean, there was the sort of one game two where Cleveland, sort of blew the doors off the Celtics, but it was, I guess, not all that surprising that the Celtics, immediately righted the ship in the next game. And, this was a series, again, that even with that one Cleveland blowout win in the middle, it was pretty clearly Boston's series to lose from the beginning. And, credit to them, ultimately, they did what they were supposed to do. But, again, this was a Cleveland team that, especially given the injuries that they had, it was good for them to sort of end their season on a slightly more, positive note of at least making it to the second round, especially given all the questions that Cleveland is going to have this offseason. I mean, it is going to be fascinating to see how the Darius Garland situation plays out, how, if Donovan Mitchell is still on the team or if he's traded come the start of next season. There could be a seismic shift in Cleveland this offseason, and so for them to at least take a game off the Eastern Conference dominating Celtics on their way out of the playoffs, it was, again, certainly not the finish to the season that Cavaliers fans were hoping for, but I think it might slide under the radar that this Cavaliers team was one of the best teams in the NBA for a significant stretch of the season, and, hopefully they bring everybody back and, Jared Allen gets healthy, obviously huge for them, but this is a Cavaliers team that had a really dominant run this season, and they've proven that they can be a top-tier team when everything is right and when they're all locked in, but ultimately they just didn't have enough to overcome this Celtics team, and, I think it would have been surprising if this series had been closer than it was, honestly, but, Cleveland does manage to take a game off the Celtics. That's about as positive and respectful performances I think the Cavaliers were going to put on against this dominant Celtics squad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, Nick, and there are going to be a lot of questions in the offseason with Cleveland. I mean, Donovan Mitchell is definitely going to be the first domino to fall. I don't know, there's talks of him maybe not exercising the player option. There's all sorts of things about him possibly being traded. You mentioned with Darius Garland, so we'll see what happens with Cleveland going forward. But the Boston Celtics, they're just rocking and rolling, and they've been dominant so far in this playoff run. And that brings us now to our Eastern Conference final matchup with the Boston Celtics going up against the Indiana Pacers. So, Nick, we've got the players that I've mentioned earlier. I mean, Indiana loaded on offense, one of the highest scoring teams in the league with Halliburton, Nesmith, Turner, also McConnell, Pascal Siakam, just to name a few. And then you have Boston led by Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And you've got Al Horford and Derek White, who's the walking three-pointer. And then Drew Holiday brings that defense, and then Peyton Pritchard coming off of the bench. This is so good in terms of you have one team that is so skilled offensively, and you have another team that's really balanced, strong on the offensive side as well as the defensive side. How do you like this matchup with the Pacers and the Celtics?
It's going to be interesting. I mentioned earlier that the Pacers had the second best offensive rating of all time this past season. The team that had the best offensive rating of all time was also this season, and it was this Boston Celtics squad. So, certainly as you mentioned, the Celtics, the best offense in the league. They have the third best defensive rating in the league, just absolutely dominant over the competition all season long. But with Indiana, I mean, they introduced an element of chaos that, is sort of the one thing that I could see knocking off this Boston Celtics before they reach a potential finals matchup with the two teams on the Western Conference side of the bracket. I mean, the ways that I think a team is going to be able to take down the Celtics, other than obviously, serious injury concerns for the Celtics, is if they can just make it a game where the Celtics are uncomfortable. I mean, the Celtics played at one of the slowest paces in the league this past season. Indiana was second in terms of being the quickest team in the league. So, they're a team that could make this a very interesting sort of stylistic matchup for the Pacers, stylistic matchup for the Celtics with the Pacers, where, if Indiana can sort of dictate the flow of the game, if they can make it a run-and-gun style affair, they have a chance to put the Celtics on their heels in a way that, honestly, no other team in the Eastern Conference side of the bracket could do. So it'll be fascinating to see sort of which team is able to impose their will earlier on in the series and sort of dictate the way that the games flow because, again, the expectation, given how dominant the Celtics have been this season, is that the Celtics are the team that sort of controls the pace, controls how the game is played. But Indiana is a team that can make things difficult for them in that regard. And, certainly on the coaching side, I mean, Rick Carlisle is one of the best coaches we have in the NBA, and Joe Mazzulla has done a wonderful job with the Celtics since he started as the coach there. But, even though he's had two great seasons, he doesn't have the incredible depth of experience that Rick Carlisle has. And, Carlisle in particular, I mean, he's someone who, made a reputation as, more of a sort of slow it down, play the game deliberately kind of coach. And he adjusted incredibly well to the roster that he has in Indiana, to the players that he has with him in Indiana. And, I'm willing to bet on Carlisle figuring out coaching stuff more than almost, not every other coach in the league, but almost every other coach in the league. And again, certainly the Pacers have the kind of squad that if they can manage to impose their will over the Celtics, they could make this interesting.
Yeah, they can make this interesting. And again, it's a tough deal for Indiana. Indiana, one of the worst defensive teams in the league, but as you stated, Nick, offense was just top-notch this year in points per game and just the way they moved the ball down the field. Down the court, it's just, they definitely made up for it, and they had the shooters to really do it. And hopefully, as you said, Pacers coach Rick Carlisle can turn up the heat and give the Pacers the toughness that they need to defend Boston. Before we get into picks, I have to ask you, who is the duo that's going to shine in this series for Indiana? Is it going to be the duo of Halliburton and Siakam, or for Boston, is it going to be Tatum and Brown?
That is a good question. I think that between those two duos, I would say that Boston probably has the advantage. I mean, Aaron Nesmith has become an incredible defender on the wing, and, I certainly don't want to bet against him having a really solid series defensively, but as you mentioned, overall, this Pacers team is not a squad that gets it done on the defensive end. They're really just offense all the time, and especially given that they're, stronger sort of up front in terms of, Miles Turner and Pascal Siakam, they're going to have a lot of trouble with dealing with the two superstar wings that the Celtics have. So I think that, if the Pacers end up, having a real chance in this series, it's going to be Tyrese and Pascal outperforming the two Jays in Boston. But I think that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have the advantage in this matchup, not only because they're two of the best wings in the league, but also because they're playing against a team that, first of all, isn't spectacular defensively, but second of all, their best defensive players are not on the wing. So, they don't really have, again, other than Aaron Nesmith, they don't really have anybody who you'd sort of think of as someone who might potentially be a wing stopper against those top Celtics guys.
All right, solid, and we'll get predictions and how many games and why in just a moment. Let's move over now to the Western Conference, and the Western Conference Finals, man, this matchup is going to be awesome between the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Before we get more into detail about this matchup, I want to start off with a thrilling game 6 between the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Dallas Mavericks. I know you have been kind of sketchy about him, but Kyrie Irving, one of the best closers in the business, doing what he does best, but Luka Doncic, the gentleman out of Slovenia, hit some big shots in Game 6. And also can't forget about Derek Lively. He contributed. P.J. Washington played well. Derrick Jones Jr. was outstanding in this game. Give me your thoughts on Dallas in the elimination game beating Oklahoma City.
Starting with Kyrie, to be clear, I've never had a problem with anything that he's done on the basketball court. It's more some of the things he's said away from the basketball court. But, in terms of on the court, again, he has one of the best handles in the history of the NBA and one of the craziest finishing packages we've ever seen for a guard of his size. His ability to finish above, under, around, through, any sort of way that you can finish a layup, Kyrie has found. There's sort of the iconic moment from these playoffs of the, triple clutch layup that he hit. But, again, he's always just been such a truly special talent with the ball in his hands. And, he proved that again in the series. And, he and Luka, I think, has figured out a lot more of sort of how to play together this year than they really ever have before. In previous years with Dallas, it's been a lot of, okay, Luka runs this play, then Kyrie runs that play. And, they've started to develop a two-man game certainly earlier on in their Dallas career. But I think that really sort of has come to fruition this season, their ability to, find the best ways to play around each other. Kyrie Irving, he's done his best work with the ball in his hands, but as anybody, who watched the Kyrie and LeBron and Cleveland squads know, he's someone who can relocate exceptionally well without the ball in his hands as well. He's someone who, again, has proven to play well with 6'8" generational talent, incredibly well gifted passing forwards, from LeBron and Luka. That's certainly a through line that you can draw, is just, how incredible they are at running the show offensively. And so, it's not all that surprising that they were able to figure stuff out together, but even still, I think this sort of two-man interplay between them has been really a step above what it's been before this season, and certainly it showed in that series against the Oklahoma City Thunder.
All right, and I wanted to talk now about Oklahoma City. They were the number 1 seed in the Western Conference, and definitely you talk about learning on the fly. They definitely learned on the fly this year despite losing the series, and this was out of nowhere because the last couple of years they were in the play-in tournament, but to be a number 1 seed and get to this point, nobody expected this. Nobody expected Chet Holmgren, both Jalen Williamses. Nobody expected, Lou Dort, what a talent he is. SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Chet Holmgren, what a nice rookie year he had. And also you put Isaiah Joe in the mix as well. What are your thoughts on Oklahoma City going forward?
I mean, going forward, I think they have one of, if not the best situations in the NBA. I mean, I think, there were plenty of people who expected them to take a bit of a step forward this year, with Chet Holmgren coming back from his Liz Frank injury that caused him to miss what would have been his rookie year last year. That and just another year of development for the rest of the young guys on this OKC squad. I think it wasn't, entirely unexpected that they were better this year than they were last year, but I mean, going from the 10 seed and a play-in team to the number 1 seed in the Western Conference, certainly that is a leap that nobody expected to happen this quickly. And so, for this Thunder squad, I think, even if they'd been like 5th or 6th in the Western Conference this season and, bowed out in the first round of the playoffs, that this would still be seen as a pretty good season from them. I mean, this team is just, Chet Holmgren, his age 21 season, Jalen Williams, his age 22 season, the oldest of their sort of young core at this point is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who was nearly just the MVP and put up another 30-point-game season, and this was his age 25 season. This is an OKC team that is well ahead of schedule, and, even with that in mind, I mean, they have a plethora of draft picks going forward, and again, pretty much everybody who's a, serious contributor to their rotation this past season. Really, Kenrich Williams was the only guy who, played sort of a significant role on this team that was over the age of 25. This is a team that should not be this good this early on in their developmental trajectory. So, this season didn't quite end the way they wanted to, obviously. I mean, it's, never the end to a season that a team wants if they're the number 1 seed and they don't make it to the NBA Finals. But, I mean, this was a very hard-fought series against Dallas. Both teams averaged exactly 106 points a game. This was tightly contested all the way, other than the first game, which was, a bit of a blowout for OKC. Every single other game in this series was within 10 points, and certainly Game 6, ending with Dallas up 117-116. It's just incredibly tightly fought series for a 6-game series, and OKC is obviously going to be a little bit disappointed that they're going home, maybe a round or two earlier than they might have hoped, but this team has so much room to grow, and for them to be as ridiculously good as they were this past season, it's got to be scary for fans of any other team in the Western Conference.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right about that, Nick, and they are indeed ahead of schedule, and the future is definitely bright for the Oklahoma City Thunder with Holmgren, Alexander, also Dort, and Williams, and just a ton of talent over in OKC, and the future is definitely bright, and also kudos to Coach of the Year award winner Mark Daigneault. And let's move over now to the other Western Conference semifinal matchup. What a Game 7 it was. You talk about a tale of two halves. The latter part of the third quarter, Anthony Edwards stole the ball from Jamal Murray, did a slam dunk, and then just right before the end of the third quarter, he nails a key three-pointer to cut the lead to 1, and Minnesota never looked back. And give props to Nikola Jokic. He practically played the whole game, but the big man, you could see he was tired a little bit. The defense really tightened up on the Joker, even though when Gobert got in foul trouble, Towns was in foul trouble. Great double team by Towns, and of course Naz Reid, an unsung hero in this playoff series. Minnesota wins the series. Give me your thoughts on the Timberwolves in their Game 7 win.
First of all, I just have to say, what a spectacular playoff series. Just when the lights were at their brightest, both of these teams played some of the most fun, exciting basketball that we have seen in a long time, not just this playoffs, but I think this series, might, depending on how the rest of the season goes for the Timberwolves, this series might go down as, one of the playoff series that really sort of told the course of, maybe it's a bit hyperbolic to say this, but it feels like that after this series is one of the more monumental series we've had in the past couple of years. And, man, this Timberwolves squad has been incredible all year. I mean, they were the number one seed in the West for most of the year. You know, they tailed off a bit towards the end of the season, but they're playing their best basketball at the best time. And, you know, again, it looked like their season was over in the third quarter of the final game. And for them to manage to put on the turnaround they did, for them to just absolutely put the clamps on the Nuggets for the second game in a row. I mean, it wasn't quite a 70-point affair like Game 6 was, but Minnesota's defense has been smothering all year long, and at the time when they needed it most, they put on an absolute masterclass. And again, this was just such an incredible series, and certainly, you know, for Denver to, you know, go out before the conference finals after winning the title last year, you know, has to feel a bit disappointing, and certainly feels, you know, even more disappointing from their perspective, given that they were, again, up 20 in the third quarter. You know, they had this game on lock before Minnesota figured basically everything out and put on an incredible run to get back into the lead. Just what an incredible series. And, you know, you mentioned Nikola Jokic doing absolutely everything he could to keep this Nuggets squad afloat. You know, this was not the best playoffs and far from the best series that we've ever seen from Jamal Murray. And, you know, the rest of the Nuggets supporting cast was very up and down, but just a heroic effort from Nikola Jokic to, you know, keep Denver in this series, really. But ultimately, Minnesota just figured out enough on the defensive end to shut down one of the most prolific offensive players we've ever seen. And credit to them, you know, this has been a coming out party for Anthony Edwards, certainly, you know, an incredible playoff that he's had, but this Timberwolves squad overall has, you know, taken down a champion. They've taken down, you know, one of the real titans of the last few years of the NBA, and, you know, obviously Denver is going to come back next season, you know, firing, ready to win their title belt back, as it were, but in the meantime, just credit to the Timberwolves for, you know, a series that looked like it might be over in that last game from a series where, you know, again, Minnesota won the first two games pretty comfortably. You know, there were certainly talks of, you know, Denver falling apart, Denver not being able to beat this Timberwolves team, and yet Denver won Game 3, Game 4, Game 5. This was, I've said it multiple times already, but it just bears repeating. What an incredible series that we all just got to witness, and what a truly spectacular performance by not just Anthony Edwards, but the Minnesota Timberwolves as a team, especially in that last game, to keep their title hopes alive after Denver looked like they were about to close the door on them.
I want to stay just with this series that had wrapped up, and again, it was fantastic, especially that Game 7. They say, Nick, it's not how you start, it's how you finish, and certainly Anthony Edwards lived up to that motto in Game 7. Did not play well at all in the first half, but middle of the third quarter, his defense he really tightened up his defense on Jamal Murray, got the steal from him, hit the three-pointer, cut the lead to 1 to end the third quarter. Then in the fourth quarter, not only making key passes, but making key shots just enough to help his team beat the Nuggets in Game 7. How would you grade his performance in that Game 7?
I can't give it anything other than an A+. I mean, it's a bit much. It's a bit hyperbolic because he really did struggle in that first half. But as we said, you know, it was how you finished. And this game, again, it looked like Minnesota was dead in the water in the middle of that third quarter. And for Anthony Edwards to lead this comeback was something that would be spectacular for a player of any age. But the way that he's playing already, you know, in his age 22 season, just absolutely incredible. You know, he cemented himself, you know, he was an all-star last season, you know, but that was a step below what we've seen from him this year when he's just been an absolute force. And, I mean, you mentioned the defense. This was a guy who his first year in the league was, you know, really, really, really tough watch on defense. You know, someone who struggled to figure out where he was supposed to be, someone who, you know, struggled to sort of find the right mix between being aggressive with his defense versus, you know, letting guys sort of get past him. I mean, he's someone who I expected to be a project on the defensive end anyway, and, it was something where I expected, maybe at some point in his career he'll figure it out. No, he's there already. He's, elite. He's the leader of one of the best defensive teams in the league, and, he's become an incredible defender in his own right already. Again, I talked about the Oklahoma City Thunder being ahead of schedule, but Anthony Edwards is way ahead of schedule, and this Timberwolves team, again, just absolutely spectacular defensively, and that was what won them this game. I mean, again, them holding Denver, to the poor second half shooting performance that they did, the poor, performance overall that they had in the second half. Man, I mean, I've said it already, but it bears repeating. The Timberwolves looked like they might be dead in the water, and yet instead they pulled off a, semi-miraculous comeback, and Anthony Edwards, as he has been all season for the Timberwolves, was the star of the show.
Yeah, definitely, and we're seeing the continued development and the growth in Anthony Edwards as a player, and certainly that's going to be scary because they're looking at him as the possible face of the NBA, and why not just with his play, but with his personality. So definitely somebody will definitely continue to watch for years to come. And let's talk briefly about Denver. So the defending champions, they're going on vacation now, but we do know that the core is going to be together for at least another year or two. Nikola Jokic is not going anywhere. MPJ, Michael Porter Jr. is going to be back. I believe Jamal Murray is going to be back another year as well. The nucleus is going to be back. Aaron Gordon is going to be back. Now, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope has a player option. What do you think is going to Denver's going to try to improve on in the offseason?
That's an interesting question. First of all, I would assume that Kentavious Caldwell-Pope picks up that player option. I would assume that he's back next year, but, I mean, again, it's not a guarantee, obviously. I mean, in terms of, this team, I think it's a lot more of a question of what it looks like after next season, because after next season is when Jamal Murray's contract expires. Aaron Gordon will be on a player option, and I think the chances of him picking up that player option are smaller than the chances of KCP picking up his option, post this season. So it'll be very interesting. In terms of targets for Denver, I mean, it's sort of interesting because with Nikola Jokic in the fold, it's almost like really anybody who can be a rotation contributor, Jokic will find a way to make it work with them offensively. I mean, in terms of what they need most, I would say, another center just to give Nikola Jokic a breather. I mean, DeAndre Jordan had a few throwback games this year, but he's not someone who you can rely on to sort of consistently pick up minutes. And it forces Aaron Gordon to play as a small ball five a lot, which is something that he could do very well. And certainly Peyton Watson had a breakout year for the Nuggets this year. And, he's someone who, isn't going to spend much time as a small ball five, but certainly is a big man who's going to get more minutes in their rotation going forward. But I think just someone to bolster Nikola Jokic would be huge for them. And then beyond that, I mean, this team was actually dead last in three-point attempts this past season. It was Orlando basically all year, and then Denver, didn't put up enough threes sort of down the stretch of the season, which led to them actually, being the bottom of the league in terms of three-point attempts. I think they would love to bring in another couple shooters to give Nikola Jokic more people to kick out to. I mean, especially given his playoff heroics of the past, I think people are burying Jamal Murray a little bit too much for his poor performance in these playoffs, but, he did have a very poor playoff, and, certainly, as you mentioned, Anthony Edwards' defense didn't help in that last series, but all playoff long, it's really been a matter of Nikola Jokic sort of carrying this Nuggets team despite not getting enough from their number two guy in Jamal Murray. And I think what they're going to do this offseason is more going to be, tooling around the edges, like getting a backup center, getting another couple shooters. I don't think there's going to be any major overall this offseason, but when you're talking about next offseason and both Jamal Murray and Aaron Gordon might be out the door, that, I think, will be the real test of what this Nuggets team looks like sort of going forward.
Before we move on and preview the Western Conference Finals, if Bruce Brown stayed in Denver, do you think this would have been the same result, or do you think the series would have ended differently?
It's tough. I mean, I think given that Denver almost won this, like, Denver had this series in the bag with 22 minutes left to go in Game 3, I think that the addition of Bruce Brown back into this squad would have been enough to push them over the edge because, I mean, they almost won anyway, and certainly with Bruce Brown and his versatility, you know, his ability to contribute on both ends of the floor, his ability to, you know, be someone who can sort of run interesting kind of inverted pick and roll looks where, you know, he's the roll man off Nikola Jokic handling the ball. There's a lot of wrinkles that Bruce Brown added to this Nuggets team that helped them get over the line to a championship. And, you know, again, given that they almost beat the Timberwolves in this series without Bruce Brown, I have to imagine that if Bruce Brown was in the fold and, you know, getting some of the minutes that went to Christian Brown and Justin Holiday and, you know, players of that sort of echelon, I think that Bruce Brown would have been enough to push Denver over the edge in this series. And, you know, it was a decision that I was interested by, let's put it that way, when Denver decided to move on from Bruce Brown. But, you know, it was always going to be a difficult situation to make the money work with Bruce Brown. And, you know, certainly he got, you know, a much bigger contract than he could have possibly gotten in Denver. But, man, given how close this series was, even without Bruce Brown involved, I'd have to assume that if Denver had him back for these playoffs, that they would have managed to triumph over this Timberwolves squad.
All right, fair enough. And now let's get to the big one. This is going to be an explosive one in the Western Conference with the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves in the Western Conference Finals. So, I mean, we've got this is star power galore in this series. Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, Anthony Edwards, Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid. We've got P.J. Washington, Derek Lively, and you got Derek Jones Jr. I mean, the list. Also Daniel Gafford as well. I mean, we have got some stars and we've got some solid defensive big men in this series. What's your take on this matchup with the Mavs and the Timberwolves?
This is a fascinating one. I mean, you mentioned some of the players, but this Dallas team was a completely different team after the trade deadline than they were before the trade deadline. And I mean, P.J. Washington coming in and starting almost every game down the stretch. Daniel Gafford, you know, providing another option for them at center, you know, making sure that Derek Lively wasn't, you know, the guy who was the only center who was sort of being leaned on in this Dallas offense. And, of course, you know, being leaned on to try and clean some things up on the defensive end. I mean, you know, this Maverick squad ended up as the 5th seed in the Western Conference, but if we're just talking about, you know, this Dallas team post their loss to Milwaukee on February 3rd, they were one of the best teams in the NBA down the stretch. I mean, they closed the season 24-9. You know, this is a team that their seeding in the playoffs isn't really indicative of who they were as a team because after the trade deadline, it was night and day between, you know, who they were, you know, in January and who they were in February. And, you know, Gafford and P.J. Washington are the main reasons why this Dallas team was so much better down the stretch than they were beforehand. But, you know, it's a really interesting matchup in the sense that, you know, again, Dallas was better defensively down the stretch of the season, but really this is an offense-first team. You know, it's kind of similar to the Celtics-Pacers matchup in that, you know, Boston, one of the best defensive teams in the NBA. Minnesota, the best defensive team in the NBA this past season. I don't think we've talked enough about Rudy Gobert yet. You know, him winning his 4th Defensive Player of the Year award, him hitting that turnaround over Jokic as part of that Minnesota comeback. It'll be very interesting because, you know, again, Minnesota's the team that has the best defensive pieces to deal with what Dallas could do on offense, but the Dallas team that we've seen over the past 3 months has been one of the better offensive teams in the NBA, and certainly they have a ton of pieces to throw at the Timberwolves. You know, Timberwolves have that spectacular, you know, sort of big 3 center rotation of Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, and Naz Reid, but you know, with Derek Lively, with Daniel Gafford, with P.J. Washington, with Maxi Kleber even, who, has been incredibly effective for Dallas in the past, even though he hasn't played as much down the stretch because of, Gafford and P.J. Washington coming into the fold. There's a lot of fascinating matchups to look at with this series, and it's not quite the difference in styles that the Celtics-Pacers matchup will provide, but these are two teams that play very differently, and it'll be very interesting to see who sort of wins the battle of imposing their will on the other, because this could be, a grinded-out defensive series, which would be a huge advantage for the Timberwolves. This could be an up-and-down, run-and-gun offense kind of series, which would be a huge boost to the Dallas Mavericks' chances.
Yeah, you're right about that, Nick. This is going to be a matchup of differing styles. You've got one team that is balanced, but really their meat and potatoes this year was defense, and especially with Rudy Gobert, a four-time Defensive Player of the Year, Karl Anthony Towns. He's strong defensively, the best shooting big man in the league who can cause matchup problems. And then Naz Reid, what can you say about him, right? And then I think Mike Conley could be an X factor as well, considering his leadership and him being a coach on the court. So I asked you in the East about who is the better duo and who's going to shine in that particular series. I got to ask you in the West, which duo is going to shine the brightest in this series, Luka and Kyrie or Edwards and Towns?
It's interesting. I think that, and we'll get into predictions, I'm assuming in a moment here, I think that just in terms of a duo that Dallas would have the edge, but I think the top three for the Timberwolves in Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Karl Anthony Towns is going to be, they're going to do better, I think, than the top three for Dallas, which would be Doncic, Irving, and, I guess pick your poison, right, of who you think the most impactful third player for the Mavericks is. I mean, really, it was a lot of, Irving and Doncic sort of running the show. I guess given the way he's played down the stretch, it might be P.J. Washington as that third guy, but if we're just talking about duos, I think that the Dallas duo has the advantage, but if we're talking sort of top-line guys, I think the Timberwolves have such a strong top three, and, I'm not sure Dallas can match sort of the combined star power of those three, even if I'm more willing to bet on success from the Dallas duo necessarily than I am the Minnesota duo.
All right, solid. There's definitely going to be some key matchups in this particular series. All right, now it's time for predictions. So let's start off with the Eastern Conference Finals. We have the Indiana Pacers going up against the Boston Celtics. All right, Nick, for the moment of truth, who wins and how many games and why?
I'm going to say Celtics in 5, which is a boring prediction because the Celtics won the first round in 5. They won the conference semis in 5, and I think they win this conference finals in 5. I think that, again, Indiana has had a spectacular year. They're way ahead of schedule, but this Celtics team is a juggernaut, and I think that, even when you sort of talk about the incredible year Tyrese Halliburton's had, Pascal Siakam joining the fold as sort of the second tentpole star for this Pacers squad. I mean, this Celtics team dominated all comers this regular season. They've been, other than a couple of, poor outings, they've been pretty dominant this postseason as well. I would be very surprised if Indiana makes this a really competitive series. I think they'll have at least one game where their offense just gets up and down the court to the degree that the Celtics aren't quite able to handle them, but I'd be surprised if this series runs particularly long, and I would be shocked if the Indiana Pacers end up taking this one.
Yeah, Indiana had a nice run this year, but, man, you mentioned Boston is just, they're just loaded, and that depth is just really good. I mean, they're offensive juggernauts in their own right, too, but, man, defensively they're pretty strong, too. So Nick likes Boston at 5, and now let's switch over to the Western Conference now. The Dallas Mavericks, Minnesota Timberwolves. Who wins and how many games and why?
This is tougher. I think I'm going to go with Minnesota. I'm trying to decide between 6 or 7 games. I think that this one will go, I'll say 7 games to be safe. I mean, I think that, Dallas has had an incredible run sort of to close the season. Again, they're a different squad than they were earlier in the year when they weren't, one of the elite teams in the Western Conference. But, I mean, this Timberwolves team just took down the reigning champs. They just had a comeback performance for the ages in that Game 7 against the Nuggets. And, again, maybe Dallas has more star power up top with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, but once you get past those top 2 guys, I mean, I bet on, Rudy Gobert over PJ Washington. I bet on Mike Conley over, Tim Hardaway Jr. I bet on really the 3 through 10 of this Minnesota roster. I think is a lot stronger than the sort of 3 through 10 for Dallas. And, again, when you're talking about playoff series, the rotations tighten up a bit. You're not relying as much on the players deeper on your bench, but ultimately, I think that Minnesota has the better starting lineup. Even if Dallas has a better duo, again, I think that Minnesota trio trumps anything that Dallas is going to throw out there. Man, it's really tough for me to decide between 6 or 7, but I think I would be more surprised by Dallas winning this series than I would by Minnesota winning this series in 6 games. So I'm going to say Minnesota in 7. I think it's going to be a really fascinating series. I think there's going to be a lot of sort of stylistic battles going on, but ultimately this Timberwolves squad has put together such a spectacular year, and especially after that Dallas series, it's really hard to bet against them. So, I think that Dallas is going to make it very competitive. I think it's going to be a series that Dallas certainly could win. I'm much more confident in their chances than I am in Indiana's chances, but ultimately I think the Timberwolves just have too much for them to deal with, so I'm going to say Minnesota in 7.
It's tough to win in the Western Conference, not just in the regular season, but in the playoffs as well. And we've seen that for such a long time, and certainly this should be a barn burner between the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves in this year's Western Conference Finals. And speaking of bringing the heat, Nick Agar-Johnson always bringing the heat with the NBA previews, whether it be regular season, playoffs, All-Star game, whatever, he's got it. And Nick, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on the program. Tell everybody, Nick, where they can find you on social media as well as No Ceilings and Kings Weekly.
For sure. So you can find me at NBA Johnson. All of my work will go up on my Twitter page at some point, be it this interview, be it Kings Weekly, be it No Ceilings. It'll all be there on my Twitter page. No Ceilings, you can find at No Ceilings NBA on any social media site that you might be using, and No Ceilings TV on YouTube, and then, again, Kings Weekly on all podcast players and social at Kings Weekly Pod.
All right, and you heard it from him. He's Nick Agar-Johnson. He's the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast, giving us predictions as well as the previews of both this year's Eastern Conference Finals and Western Conference Finals matchups. Nick, as always, thank you so much, my man. If ever you want to come back on, feel free to let us know.
Ed, thank you so much for having me back on.
All right, everybody, that's going to do it for this edition of the program. Once again, a big special thank you to Nick Agar-Johnson, host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Once again, a big special thank you to Nick for appearing on the program. Till next time, everybody, I'm Ed Robinson saying so long, and you take care. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the channel. Remember to click like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.